Hello and welcome to U.S. News and World Report. I'm Simon Owens, and joining me today is Nicco Mele, an entrepreneur, investor, and author of the new book, The End of Big: How the Internet Makes David the New Goliath, where he details the benefits and consequences of living in a socially connected society. Welcome, Nicco.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Nicco, one of the most fascinating parts of your book is when you give a first-hand account of the Howard Dean campaign in 2004. A lot of people involved in online activism point to that campaign as one of the first instances of a president harnessing the internet to raise money. But it turns out that the Dean's campaign wasn't internet savvy from the very beginning. What happened when you tried to originally tried to donate to him?
Well, actually, I'd gone to an event where I was supposed to hear Howard Dean give a speech. It was a meetup, actually, at the Essex Lounge in New York City. And I actually couldn't even get into the event. And so the next day, I went to work and I Googled, Howard Dean for president. But I couldn't find his website. So I ended up buying on my own dime some Google search ads to make it easier to find his official presidential website, which at the time had terrible SEO and was buried well past the first page of search results.
And the campaign didn't even know that you were doing this.
That's right. I was just like my little gift to them. And then a few weeks later, I woke up and I had this giant credit card bill that the search volume had, because the first couple of days I had checked it and it seemed like it was pretty modest, so I just let it go. And then a few weeks later, I got a giant bill from Google for AdWords that it was like a hockey stick. Search volume had just dramatically increased. And so I called up the campaign and said, first I waited on hold over an hour, and then I said to someone on the campaign, you should really do this. You could really raise a lot of money. And the woman on the other end, a woman who got to be a good friend named Zephyr Teachout, said, we don't really have anyone here who knows how to do that. So if you want to do it, you have to move here to Vermont and do it.
And which I'm guessing was kind of a shocking proposition.
I hung up the phone and I was like, oh, well, that's a little crazy. But, I was young and living in New York City, and I'd always wanted to work on a presidential campaign. So after mulling it over for a few days, I said, what the heck, if I can't do it now, when will I ever do it? And packed my car and drove up to Burlington.
Yeah. Well, obviously now it's become almost old hat that candidates are able to raise a lot of money online. You saw these huge bombs, donation bombs, on dig.com for Ron Paul and then later for Barack Obama. But you argue in the book that while the internet has been great for political fundraising, it hasn't been utilized much for persuasion. What do you mean by that?
Well, if we think about how political campaigns work, take the Obama presidential campaign. Obama raised somewhere north of $500 million on the internet and turned around and spent most of that money on television ads and radio ads. And so why? Well, because if you spend the money on advertising, you can see shifts in public opinion that matter when you're trying to win a presidential race. To date, the internet's been very effective at reaching your supporters, especially your base, getting them fired up, using them to raise money, but it's been I'd say pretty weak at looking at changing people's minds. And one good symptom of that is the vast majority of the money spent on television advertising is spent on negative advertising. But if you look at but it's almost impossible to find negative advertising online. It doesn't. There's a good question why, and one thing I suggest is that it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's more potential in terms of local campaigns? Obviously, a lot of time is spent pointing out that a lot of the media markets, especially for television ad buys, are incredibly inefficient because they span over like multiple congressional districts. So for every dollar you spend, it's getting spent on being seen by people who would never be able to vote for you anyway. So do you think that a lot of this potential exists on the internet in terms of how tightly you can micro-target people?
Well, that makes sense, but the reality is I'm not sure we're seeing that. In fact, whereas the presidential campaigns have raised somewhere north of 50% of their funds online for the last two cycles, both Republicans and Democrats, when you get down to statewide gubernatorial, Senate, House races, and even smaller races, mayoral and local races, it's very unusual to find more than 10 or 15% of the money raised online. In every race except for national races, the vast majority of the money raised is still raised in the old-fashioned, $1,000 a head for dinner or $250 a head for dinner, with some, depending on the politician, sometimes a direct mail operation to supplement that. Online fundraising outside the presidential level is definitely growing, is definitely becoming a bigger deal, but is still mostly the bulk of it is really in national races. Mm-hmm. And sometimes a local race becomes a national race. I think that happened in part with Michelle Bachmann's reelection last time. Also, when Scott Brown ran against first the Attorney General Martha Coakley here in Massachusetts, and then against Elizabeth Warren, both of those races got nationalized because of the personalities involved and because it was Ted Kennedy's seat, and had raised a lot of money online. But the vast majority of local and congressional races are still trying to figure out how to make the web work for them.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, your book approaches this democratizing effect of the internet to be largely a good thing, but you also raise some points about the pitfalls. What are some of them?
Well, broadly speaking, there's been this diffusion of power from hierarchical institutions to individuals. In 1970, a computer, for the most part, was a giant, expensive thing. $5 million would have filled a large room, was really only accessible to the world's largest institutions, companies, governments. Mm-hmm. But today...
And I saw some recent thing that said that the power of a PlayStation 3 now is equivalent to a supercomputer in 1997.
Yeah. And 130 million Americans have smartphones with the power equal to or greater than a Cray supercomputer from the 70s. And so there's been this tremendous diffusion of power from, these machines used to be really only for the Pentagon and a few large research institutions and a few large companies. And now more than half of Americans, almost 2/3, walk around with them in their pockets. And that's a tremendous diffusion of power, and it has dramatic consequences for any kind of authority, any kind of institution that is set up to manage power hierarchically. And we're just not prepared for that. We don't have any sense of what that can mean, and it can wreak havoc in the meantime.
Mm-hmm. This is kind of, I think you used the phrase mob mentality, kind of what we saw when people were playing detective during the Boston bombing investigation.
That's right. And, the Boston bombing is a good example. It is totally natural in the age of social media that people would want to go online and participate and be a part of both the investigation and the news in an event like that, a shocking, tragic event that really moves people. People are going to want to participate. And the Boston police, the FBI did an excellent job, but their way of asking for assistance from people was to put up a form circa 1999 where people could submit photos they'd taken. No ratings, no reviews, no other. We have more than a decade of best practices in crowdsourcing and in harnessing the energy of people online in a distributed fashion. And yet our big institutions aren't prepared for that. They don't have ways of integrating that or using that to their advantage. And so that energy goes other places. It goes to Reddit or 4chan, to places where there's no expertise or leadership to give integrity to the process, which can lead us in some upsetting directions.
Well, probably one of the first industries to be really affected by the rise of the internet was the music industry with the advent of Napster in 1999. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on how well that industry has adapted in the last 13 years, and can it provide a model for how other industries can adapt?
That's a good question. I think one of the challenges in the music industry is the extent to which the organizational layer of the music industry, mostly record labels, are disappearing. They're a lot less important and valuable than they were 2 decades ago. And we just had Macklemore, one of the first #1 Billboard hits, who was unsigned, not with any label. We we don't have this organization layer to cultivate and encourage talent, to figure out new methods of distribution. But we do have things like Kickstarter and Spotify and new vehicles for what they call social discovery. And so the innovation in music is coming out of places unrelated to the traditional music industry, right? Mm-hmm. And that's classic, the innovator's dilemma. That's classic disruption, disruptive innovation. And what I am concerned about, or what I wrote the book about, is this kind of middle layer of this organizational layer that exists between, in the case of music, between artists and listeners. There was this organizational layer, and that organizational layer is going away. And artists aren't actually making more money, and consumers have more choice than ever before, but it's not necessarily cheaper for them. And so the question is, how do we want music to work? How do we want creative people to be compensated for their work? How do we want to consume and listen to our entertainment? And what are vehicles for making sure that all happens in a way that encourages excellence, that brings out the best both for consumers and for artists?
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned Kickstarter. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on the recent Zach Braff Kickstarter campaign to fund his movie. Some people say that this is a great way to use the crowdfunding power of the internet to bypass Hollywood, but I've seen also some critics say that Braff and other stars are siphoning off money that could be going to truly independent filmmakers.
Well, they're probably both right. I don't think they're mutually exclusive necessarily. There's no doubt that Kickstarter is part of an emerging ecosystem of this organizational layer for funding creative projects. And there's also a new distribution layer. So there's new funding vehicles, and there's new distribution vehicles. You know, Netflix and this past weekend, the Arrested Development premiere, that's a pretty radically new distribution vehicle, one without any advertising, right? That's going to turn the history of television on its head. And I think that the question for me is not did Zach take away from other, producers or other artists, but more how can we create a lot more of that kind of activity overall? That Kickstarter and Indiegogo simply aren't enough to allow the biggest, broadest ecosystem of media and entertainment to flourish. So how can we have a lot more activity, both in terms of platforms and avenues and new institutions for this organizational layer for entertainment, but also how can we, what should we worry about getting lost? Game of Thrones is $6 million an episode, and they start taping it in some cases years in advance. And so would you give $100 a month for 3 years to a show you're not going to see until the very end? There's some question about how we navigate funding and what the culture is going to encourage and reward.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess the reason I asked that question is I wonder if the internet, when it first started, really was just an army of Davids. And when I say that, I'm thinking about the independent nerd bloggers in the mid-2000s who were kind of web celebrities like Doc Searles and Jason Kotke, or even when you think about the start of OK Go on YouTube. But it seems that the most popular content is becoming less and less amateur, and the Goliaths are just taking over. Is it just are the Goliaths just shifting from one medium to another?
Oh, I'm unconvinced of that. I don't, I see a lot more Davids every day than I see of Goliaths adopting the new medium. For most of the big megastars and mega companies in entertainment, but really in any industry, there's very little to be gained from the web approach, from, the distributed network approach. They're very happily entrenched in their current hierarchies that are quite lucrative and have a lot of opportunity for them. What's happening is that as those hierarchies do a bad job, people are simply opting out. They're finding alternatives, and it's that in Davids, right? In large distributed activity, and that's what's exciting. I mean, in 1981, the top 10 highest grossing films most of them, I think it was 8 of them, were original stories, original scripts. And in 2012, the top 10 highest grossing films, every single one, 2011, 20 years later, or 30 years later, every single one of the top 10 highest grossing films in 2011 was a remake or a sequel. There were no original stories or characters. And you know, I think people are tired of that. They want quality, they want variety. And you know, YouTube is breeding new stars every day. There's no doubt that some of the web material is getting more polished and higher production values, but there's just it's still a giant field of opportunity for aspiring YouTube stars every day. The real question is, how are those YouTube stars going to make a living? That's a harder and more significant question. There are no residuals in YouTube.
Well, Nicco, those were all the questions I had. Thanks so much for joining us.